Hello, this is Dr. Ken Blake from Middle Tennessee State University School of Journalism. I'm going to talk about 6 rules for writing straight news leads. There are plenty of leads that are awfully good that do not conform to all or even any of these rules, but what I'm doing here is giving you some guidelines that if you follow those guidelines, you'll write a good lead every time. So let's get right to it. Here are the 6 rules. Rule number 1, straight news lead should be a single paragraph consisting of a single sentence, should contain no more than 30 words, and should summarize at minimum the most newsworthy what, where, and when of the story. Here's the second rule. The lead's first verb should express the main what of the story and should be placed among the lead's first 7 words. Third rule, halfway done, the lead's first verb should be active voice, not passive voice. We'll talk more about what that means in a minute. Rule number 4, if there's a who involved in the story, the lead should give some indication of who the who is. Number 5, the lead should summarize the why and how of the story, but only if there's room. And finally, if what's in the lead needs to be attributed, place the attribution at the end of the lead. Okay, so let's do an example here. Here's a set of facts, typical set of facts that you might get in a beginning journalism course. There was a house fire. It started today. Let's pretend today is Monday. At 6 a.m., the house was at 212 Main Street. A man who lived alone there died in the fire. He was 88 years old. His name was Harold Flanagan, and the city's arson investigator says faulty wiring caused the fire. So now just thinking about the kind of main concepts in this set of facts, the most newsworthy things, I can come up with 3. There's the idea of a fire. Okay, so a fire happened. It happened at a house, so you have a house fire going on. That's probably kind of important to convey. And to me, most importantly, there was a fellow there named Harold Flanagan who died. So those are 3 things we might want to be sure we stress in the lead. So when I'm starting to write a lead, I typically just put some possibilities on paper or on the computer screen, actually, and I start doing that by just coming up with some subject-verb combinations that summarize what I see as the key points of the story. So here's a possibility. We could go with house was destroyed, a subject-verb combination, house being the subject, was destroyed being the verb. Another possibility, fire destroyed. Let's say, what did the destroying? A fire destroyed. And a third possibility, Harold Flanagan, the name of the victim. Harold Flanagan was killed. Now, each of these has some things that are good about them, some things that are not so good. For example, house was destroyed. Well, that's passive voice. What we mean by passive voice is where the verb in the sentence, in this case was destroyed, doesn't make the subject, in this case house, do anything. Let me see, house doesn't do anything here. House has something done to it. House was destroyed by some unnamed force or person, in this case the fire. Well, that's the hallmark of passive voice, and it's kind of boring to read and to listen to, so it's much better to write an active voice. So that's kind of a problem with that one. How about this one, fire destroyed? Well, that's active voice. See, now the subject, fire, is doing something. The verb makes the subject take action. Fire destroyed. So that's good. That's active voice. And we also have Harold Flanagan was killed. So here we have an emphasis on perhaps the most newsworthy aspect of the story, the death of the man who lived at the house. But again, it's passive voice. The subject, Harold Flanagan, doesn't do anything. Flanagan has something done to him. He is killed by, in this case, the fire. So it's passive voice, but it's perhaps more newsworthy than the others. So looking at all 3 of these, maybe a better option would be to do something like this. Harold Flanagan died in a house fire. So now we've got the emphasis on the man who was killed, the man who died, Harold Flanagan, but the structure is active voice, so that's good. And we've got a lot of the sort of major components of the story figured out here. So that's a good place to start. Let's just go with that. This is active voice and it's focused on the news. What I'll typically do is just put my best candidate so far kind of at the top of the page. And actually when I'm doing this on the computer screen, I'll keep all of my drafts until I'm completely done with writing the lead. That way you don't throw away ideas, you just kind of set them aside in case you need them again. So let's put the top candidate up here at the top of the screen. And then kind of move on with writing the lead. Now, there's kind of an immediate problem here in that this fella Harold Flanagan is not particularly famous among the members of among the audience for this story. It's not, his name isn't one that most people reading the story will immediately recognize. So in that case, it's better to write what we call a blind lead. In other words, the audience really doesn't know anything about Flanagan, but if you tell them something about Flanagan that they can relate to, then the lead will do a better job of communicating. So, for example, if we describe him as an elderly man, that's going to make more sense, and that's what's called a blind lead, because you're deferring his name. We'll certainly give his name probably in the next paragraph of the story, but just not in the lead. Let's tell people about Harold Flanagan before we give Harold Flanagan's name. So if Flanagan were the mayor or somebody who was whose name would be widely recognized, then sure, you'd put the name in the lead. But in this case, he's just kind of an ordinary guy. So that's one change we made right away. Let's stick with that. Let's think now about adding the where and the when elements. Remember, both of those are required under the 6 rules. So if we look for the where, well, down in the facts, we see that that's 212 Main Street. Okay, and the when is Monday, today. So let's see where we could stick these into the draft of the lead that we have so far. How about right here? Monday on Main Street, an elderly man died in a house fire. Okay, so we got the where and the when in, but there's kind of an issue. What we've done by putting the where and the when on the front of the lead, we've pushed the really newsworthy stuff to the end of the lead. And that's a problem. In a lead, you want the news to be right up front where the reader can see it immediately and understand what the story is about. In fact, we even have a term for this. We call it backing into the lead. Backing because you put the news at the back of the lead rather than at the front where it belongs. Fortunately, there's usually a simple solution. Just reverse the two, which is what we do here. An elderly man died in a house fire Monday on Main Street. Okay, that's an improvement. Let's move on to adding the why and the how elements. Remember, these are optional. You put these in if you have room for them. And in this case, it's probably a good idea to put them in because all house fires are pretty much the same except for the details about how the fire began and why it began and that sort of thing. So adding the why and the how here is going to help distinguish the story from all the other ones you could write. So the why and the how is faulty wiring. We see down in the facts that that's how this fire got started. So let's just try sticking it on the end. So we have an elderly man died in a house fire Monday on Main Street caused by faulty wiring. If it sounds a little strange to you, that's because it is. It's a fairly the structure here is actually pretty complicated because this phrase on Main Street goes with the verb died, tells us where he died, and then this phrase caused by faulty wiring goes with the word fire. It tells us it's describing the fire. It's a fire caused by faulty wiring. And so to kind of mentally make sense of this story, the reader has to hit this phrase, skip back over fire and go back to died to pair that phrase with died. And then by the time the reader gets to caused by faulty wiring, they have to somehow pair it with fire. So it's kind of jumbled around, and this sentence is going to make more sense if we can put these modifying elements here closer to the actual words they modify. So let's rearrange some things. How about this? An elderly man died on Main Street Monday in a house fire caused by faulty wiring. Okay, that's a little better. We've got Main Street close to died, and we've got caused by faulty wiring close to house fire. That's better. But there's still kind of an issue. It's not clear, for example, that the house was his house. The lead tells us that this fellow died on Main Street in a house fire, but was he visiting the house? Did he run into the house to rescue somebody? Or did he live there? And this points out an important thing about leads. When you're writing a lead, remember that your audience doesn't know anything about the story. You've got all the facts from the story in your head, so it's easy to think you've communicated something that in fact you haven't. And one trick of writing a good lead is to back up and read the lead as if you knew nothing about the story. Just try to forget for a minute all the facts you know about the story and read it as someone who's coming in cold. And if you do that in this case, then you kind of see this question about the connection between the man and the house in the lead. So let's see if we can fix that. How about an elderly man died Monday when faulty wiring caused a fire that swept through his Main Street home? Okay, so now we know that it's his Main Street home, and I think this one's a little bit clearer. So let's make that our current best candidate. All right, now there's picking this apart a little bit further. There's kind of a sequence problem here in that the real news has to do with the fire, less so perhaps than than what caused the fire. That's important to put in there, but maybe let's try to give people a sense of of generally what happened before we get into the details of how it happened. So it'd be kind of nice if we could switch the order of the faulty wiring idea and fire. Maybe something like this: an elderly man died Monday when a fire sparked by faulty wiring swept through his Main Street home. Okay, so now we have the idea of the fire ahead of the faulty wiring, and I think that's probably the one that's going to be the best we can do for now. Okay, let's think about adding some attribution. Remember, we have the city's arson investigator here as the source of the idea that the fire was caused by faulty wiring. And we could, if we were going to add attribution, always add it at the end. Don't start out with it, because there again, you're backing into the lead. You're pushing the newsworthy stuff to the end of the lead to make room for the attribution at the beginning. That's why it's better to put the attribution at the end, because that puts the news right up front, and then people can look at the attribution and see if they consider the source credible and trustworthy and all that sort of thing. So I've put the attribution at the end here. But let's ask ourselves, is it really necessary to attribute the information that's in this lead? What should you attribute? Well, you should definitely attribute statements that are overtly opinionated. And you want to be clear about whose opinion that is, because if you don't attribute it, readers are going to assume it is your opinion, you as the writer, you as the supposedly objective, non-biased journalist. So you definitely want to attribute stuff that's opinionated. You also want to attribute things that are perhaps in question, or a little bit, things that your audience might doubt, unless they know that information comes from a credible source. So I don't think anything in this lead really fits either category. Now certainly later in the story you're going to want to specify that the city's arson investigator verified that it was faulty wiring that caused the blaze. But I don't think you really need it in just right here in the lead. Now if, for example, the arson investigator had determined that a murder happened, that this fire was intentionally set, and that the man had died, well, that would be something you probably would want to add attribution to. But in this case, I think not. So let's just leave it off and stick with our this lead that we have here. Now, once you think you have a pretty good lead, and I think this one is pretty good, it's a good idea to do a final check of the 6 rules for writing a straight news lead. It's not that hard to do. Here's rule number 1, and the key components here are that the lead needs to be a single paragraph and a single sentence, and we have that. We have one paragraph here. The next paragraph of the story would start right about here, being indented a little bit, and it's certainly a single sentence. So we're covered there. How about the no more than 30 words? Well, I think so, but let's count to make sure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 words. So yeah, we're well under the 30-word limit. Of course, if you're using a word processing program, all you typically have to do is highlight that your lead, and the program will tell you how many words are in it. So you can do that as well. All right, how about kind of the minimum requirements on the elements of the lead? We need a what, and there it is, an elderly man died. That's the what of the story, the most newsworthy fact. We have the where. Yeah, we stuck in Main Street. Notice that I didn't use the full street address, the 212 Main Street thing. Again, we'll definitely put that later in the story, but for purposes of the lead, you just need to have kind of a general where. And we're assuming too that this article will be read by a local audience. So we're assuming that the audience will assume that we're talking about Main Street in the local town. If you're writing for a wire service, or for a if your story is going to be read by a wider audience, then you might need to specify the city as well, but just kind of a general idea of the where is enough for the lead. And do we have a when? Yeah, we have Monday. Again, we're not terribly precise. We know that the fire started at 6 a.m. Well, we can give that later in the story. All we really need for the lead is a general idea of the where. Okay, so rule number 1 checks out pretty well. How about rule number 2? The first verb should express the main what of the story and be placed among the lead's first 7 words. Well, there's the first verb, died, and it does express the main what. The man died. And it definitely shows up within the first 7 words. 1, 2, 3, it's the fourth word. So I think we're okay on rule number 2. How about number 3? The lead's first verb should be active voice, not passive voice. Well, there again is the first verb, died, and its subject is man, and died makes the subject man do something. The man died. It was the last thing he did, but he did do something. He did have something done to him. A passive voice example would be an elderly man was killed. In that case, the subject man would have had something done to it. The man was killed by, in this case, the fire. So that's what you would want to avoid. So rule 3 checks out pretty well. How about number 4? If there's a who involved in the story, the lead should give some indication of who the who is. Well, the who is an elderly man, and again, remember that we, because his name isn't immediately recognizable, we went ahead and just described him as an elderly man. We'll give his full name later in the story. Okay, how about rule number 5? The lead should summarize the why and how of the story, but only if there's room. Well, in this case, here's the why and the how: faulty wiring, and the fact that the fire is why the man died. And in this case, it's pretty important because, as I said earlier, this is what distinguishes this house fire from every other house fire you might write. And there was room for it, so we went ahead and put it in. And how about the attribution? Well, remember, we decided that if we were going to put attribution in, we would put it at the end, because that way it won't get in the way of the news. But we decided in this case that attribution wasn't really necessary, so we just left it off. Okay, so the final check suggests that the lead meets all 6 of the criteria just fine. And I think if you follow these criteria in your writing, you'll always write a good straight news lead. So I hope this has been helpful. Thank you very much.